Lovely. Okay, so I'll say my hello again, but hello everybody. Welcome to this Evaluation Collective event. Really lovely that everybody can join us on this afternoon. A number of people are going to be presenting today. We've got lots of things for us to talk about and lots of time and opportunity for you to engage with us as well. But you're all here because I think we have an interest in the concept or the practice of evaluating teaching and learning in higher education. So this was a topic that we've talked about quite a lot as the Evaluation Collective, and lots of us work in different spaces in relation to evaluation in teaching and learning. So I'll say a little bit about that as we progress, and then I'll pass over to some of my colleagues to say a little bit about why we're all here too. So if we move on to just say a little bit about the Evaluation Collective. So I'm seeing lots of names that I recognise, which is lovely. Really nice to see people that have come to our events before, but also really lovely that we've got a wider audience today, and there might be people on the call who is the first time they've engaged with the Evaluation Collective. So just to say a little bit about who we are and what we do before we get cracking. So my name's Liz Austin, and I'm a Professor of Higher Education Evaluation. I'm currently Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning in the College of Social Science and Arts at Sheffield Hallam University. And I've been kind of co-leading the Evaluation Collective since the end of 2021, when a number of us got together after a conference where we'd been on a panel together, and we'd had a bit of a symposium discussion about evaluation, particularly in the participation space of higher education. So a long history of evaluation in access spaces and the kind of outreach and entry into higher education, but much more of a complicated picture in relation to student success and student outcomes whilst they're with us in higher education, and what they tend to do afterwards. So we got together as a group of what we're calling ourselves as like-minded evaluation advocates, really kind of work against the definition of experts. We're not experts, we're just people plodding along trying to work out what we're doing. But really hoping that you also see yourselves in this space as well, and that we can as a collective be inclusive to anybody that wants to join and listen to what we want to say and come along to our events. So we've got a few aims. We are looking for opportunities to debate and develop knowledge about inclusive and effective evaluation practices, and that's one of the reasons that we're putting on events like this. We've had a few in a similar way, online sessions, and also an in-person event at the beginning of the month, which was lovely to see some people in person as well. We also want to challenge dominant narratives around evaluation practice, and we have an evaluation manifesto. So the link is on the screen, and just kind of Google us, the Evaluation Collective, and have a look at the kind of things that we've said previously. And our overall aim, I suppose, is to improve higher education experiences and outcomes for students, particularly those from underrepresented groups in higher education. So we're thinking about those longer term aims as well, that if we develop and talk about evaluation practices, hopefully we can make the experiences and outcomes better for our students. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about what we might be doing today. You'll have a little bit of introduction from me, and then you'll have some presentations and from Nathaniel Pickering and Jonathan Schultz, and we'll also be having time for us to talk about your reflections on these, but also bring your own experiences and ideas from your practices as well. So really, one of the kind of ethos of the Evaluation Collective is really listening and hearing from the sector. So I'm hoping that we've got lots of time to do that before we close. So we've got an hour and a half, and some of it will be us talking, and we'll record, and then we'll move into some more discussions as well. So just to talk a little bit about the scene, setting the scene. So what is it that we're talking about today? What's joined us in our collective interest? And what might you be hearing from other people speaking today? A lot less of me and a lot more of everybody else, which is also grand. So just to set the scene then, if we think a little bit about definitions of evaluation, I'm going to start there before I think about contextualizing that in the teaching and learning space. So because there might be people new to the Evaluation Collective on the call, or from different spaces, different areas of higher education, just a couple of definitions for you. One is from a really useful, not higher education focused, but very accessible resource called Better Evaluation. And they talk about evaluation as any systematic process to judge the merit, worth, or significance by combining evidence and values. So yeah, quite a simple definition, but I think it covers and has a lot of weight. And in terms of the Evaluation Collective, we define evaluation as an approach which helps to understand and explore what works and doesn't work in a given context. And importantly, it's of value to the stakeholders. The aim of evaluation is actionable evidence-informed learning and continuous improvement of process and impact. So there's some very specific overlaps between them. There's some very clear kind of distinctions and parameters of evaluation. But what we're trying to do today is locate that in the space of learning and teaching. And that's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So what other terms might we hear? I think language is something which does complicate, but also it does connect people, but it can also exclude people. So this is just some of the terms I think I've come across in my experience of thinking about teaching and learning and evaluation, and what the kind of connections are with other phrases. So we might talk about inquiry, we might talk about the scholarship of learning and teaching, which is a whole discourse around publishing and sharing our practice in peer review publications and elsewhere. We might talk about educational inquiry or practitioner inquiry. You might have heard the phrase pedagogic research, so of teaching practice, reflective practice, action research, continuous improvement, research-informed teaching, or sometimes called scholarly teaching. And then just pinned onto the end of that, you've got this term evaluation. And they all have connotations, they all have definitions, and they're all used and can at times be used interchangeably in the space of learning and teaching, and with some resonance and some impact, I think. So some institutions talk about the scholarship of learning and teaching, some talk about continuous improvement that might be connected to particular quality processes. Evaluation, I think, is a term which is growing with the APP agenda, but it's still, I don't think it's as widely used in this space as we might like. And it does have some specific connotations, brings with it methods and a body of kind of knowledge to that, which may or may not be applicable in the spaces we might be talking about today. So just to give you some more examples of that, what is starting to impact in the teaching and learning space that you might be thinking about, you might have brought with you today to be thinking about in this session? Well, we know that we have some definitions of teaching excellence from our regulator, and what was really nice to see in reflections from a TEF panel recently is they started to talk about the fact that we should be building evaluation in from the start. So a real overlap between the access and participation plan language and the teaching excellence framework, both regulatory tools, but this notion that evaluation has in the terms of the word itself, has a place there. So there's some kind of increasing expectations for evaluation in terms of showing what impact we're having in institutions. We also know that there are also complexities in the regulatory space when we're thinking about quality and standards and the measurement of quality of standards and what we need to be saying about that, particularly with this kind of connection between the Office for Students and the Quality Assurance Agency. We have some expectations now being discussed from TASO, a kind of what works centre in higher education. So particularly talking about interventions that exist in the learning and teaching space, and making statements around the fact that we need to do more causal research in order to make kind of bolder claims about the impact of the work that we're having. And we're also seeing the phrase evaluation exist in some of our professional development spaces in teaching and learning. So if anybody's familiar with the professional standards that are now kind of advocated by Advance HE, used to be the Higher Education Academy. There's also the place for evaluation in there as well. So about our own effective practice, in addition to kind of, is the institution moving where it needs to be? And there's some really nice publications about the enablers and barriers to teaching and learning inquiry, scholarship of learning and teaching by Professor Shaylee Minocha at the Open University. And if you do, she's got her own website and some fascinating insights into why what kind of work we're doing in this space and what can be most useful for us to be thinking about. Okay, and then we think about all the challenges and a lot of these Shaylee talks about. So some of it is about the spaces we're in, some of it is about the processes and systems that exist, some of it is about our workload and the kind of how those expectations for evaluation might be impacting on workload. and also capability, confidence, resources, and those kind of creeping expectations of evaluation into roles which we might be seeing now that we might not have seen in the past. Okay. We're really interested in the Evaluation Collective about really digging into some of these problems and hearing from the sector, maybe crowdsourcing ideas of what these problems are. And it is about value, and it is about what a problem means to us and how we articulate that to others. So we're really interested in the perspectives of those in the room today. So please do, use the chat to make any comments, but also let's have a little bit of a think about some of the things that might be pertinent to you as well. So we've got a couple of questions, and you might want to just use the chat and have a little bit of a think about this in your own space. We'll only dwell on this for a couple of minutes. But in the chat, think about what I've just said. Think about your own practice in your own spaces. What does the evaluation of teaching and learning mean to you? So there must have been a reason why you thought this presentation today might be of interest. Maybe it's about a role, a space, something you're interested in pursuing in the future. But if you are able to just pop a few things in the chat, then we can get a sense of why people are in the room, what we might want to channel our discussions to be about, or things that, generally might be of interest to people. So please do use the meeting chat if you're able to. Fab. So it's a couple of things coming through. Brilliant. So thinking about what works and why, really digging into evidence bases, thinking about what to share and improve. That's a really interesting one. Thinking about methods, how to build evaluation into the start of what we're doing, how to think about cultural transformation. That's fascinating. And how we start to talk about this language at maybe different levels in our own institutions, and some people seeking very specific bits of learning from today's session in terms of their own practices. Fab. Okay, so the next question, Jonathan, if you want to move us on to the next one. So this is just to think about who does the evaluation in your institution. So this, I'm really interested, you can reflect on your own practice and who you are as an individual. Or then you could think about the structure or the infrastructure of your institutions. Maybe you're in an HE institution, or maybe you're in a third sector space. That would really be interesting to know the kind of places that you're coming from and who does it. Whose responsibility is it? Is it a big team? Is it a small team? Is it no team at all? Is it an individual person? We've often heard that from inside the Evaluation Collective, that there's only one person responsible for evaluation in the whole of a university. We're all in the Evaluation Collective in very different spaces, and we're all doing bits and bobs of different types of evaluation, and you'll hear a little bit about some of those today. Fab. Okay. It depends on what's being evaluated. It does, Sally. Yeah, absolutely. Whether that's your kind of closeness to teaching practice, and that might be you as a practitioner, or you might be an independent evaluator who's been asked to come in and do some almost consultancy work. Some areas of the university have departments, and that's really interesting. And I think we're seeing an increase in some of that across higher education at the moment. So we've got, if we just need to look at the kind of job advertisements that are coming in at the moment. And thank you to people who are putting their hands up and saying, it's me, as a lone person, or in a small team. And hopefully for those people as well, there'll be lots that you can get out of today. So fab. Keep thinking about those as we're moving on. And what we're going to do now is talk a little bit and hear from others who are going to tell you about their experiences of evaluating in a learning and teaching space. So really interesting to hear where you're all at, but let's hear from others as well, and just give you some kind of tangible, practical examples of what people are doing in this space. So I think I'm going to pass over to Nathaniel, who's going to talk you through his case study, and then it will be Jonathan. Okay, over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Liz. So I'm Nathaniel Pickering. I'm a senior lecturer in evaluation and research at Sheffield Hallam. And this is a piece of work that myself and Julian, if you want to give us a wave, Rockford, worked on this kind of time last year. So the intention really, I've got a couple of slides around the kind of methodological approach, but really it's to kind of highlight some of the challenges and reflections we had with this project. Might prompt some questions, but also maybe help you frame your approach to evaluation within that learning teaching space. I think just reflecting on that as well about who does evaluation, I think that's a really crucial question and something that was really important to this piece of work. So we were working with oh, sorry, Jonathan, can you move me on, please? Yeah, so we were working with a team in nursing and midwifery who were delivering a simulated placement, and I'll come into what that looked like a little bit more. But generally, a definition is helpful here because actually what we found when we looked in the literature, there was all sorts of definitions about what a simulated placement is, and hopefully that what it consisted of at Hallam will make more sense as we go through. But essentially, it's an artificial representation of real-world practice, a scenario that supports student development and assessment through experimental learning with opportunity for repetition, feedback, evaluation, and reflection. And I think that last point is really crucial, especially to how the simulated placements were designed at Hallam, was around that kind of really student-centered approach where students could have a safe space, both for themselves and their patients, to develop their skills as nurses in there. If you could just move me on, Jonathan, if that's okay. So just to give you some context about how the simulated placements kind of developed at Hallam, and also some of that context for the sector, because this is something that is growing as well, that more institutions are offering this kind of placement to students. So the simulated placement, there were some being delivered before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, they became a kind of really crucial resource to help students gather the hours, the clinical placement hours they need to pass as a nurse. So they have to do 2,300 placement hours over their 3 years of study, and that all has to be accounted for. And so the simulated placement at Hallam now replaces some of those clinical placements or in a hospital or a care home situation. And the idea is that those hours contribute to this 2,300 because they replicate those situations that they've come across within those environments. It's really to note as well, we have the highest clinical placement hours, I think, in the world at the moment. So it's a lot of hours students have to do for those placements. And obviously there's a real challenge there because there's a crisis in the NHS, there's a shortage of staff, and that was really having an impact on how many placements could be secured for students as well. And also there were some issues around suitability and consistency of placement. So some places were delivering really good experiences for students, others not so much. And what that meant was that students were going on placements for 6 weeks, but then not getting the opportunities to sign off their proficiencies. And these proficiencies, there was quite a few of them, but that was really what placements were about, so that they could practice, and that wasn't happening. And also they changed some of the processes around that made it more difficult as well. So the placements were being delivered for 3 courses: adult nursing, childhood nursing, and mental health nursing. It was just for level 4 students. It's their first placement experience, and it was for 621 students. So it's quite a big ask from staff as well, and there's been additional staff recruited and additional resources built as well. So we now have a simulated ward that actually looks like a hospital ward on campus that students can use with dummies and things like that. So if you just move us on. So really inspired by some work that Liz Austin and Alan Donnelly did with Winchester recently as well, about taking a participatory approach to the evaluation so that the participants and the people you were evaluating felt included in that process. So we started with an initial literature review, but then we set up some advisory groups, and they really steered the methodology. So for example, they wanted these pre and post surveys, but they didn't want a quantitative survey, which kind of threw us slightly in that design process. But these were really useful and really beneficial. But I won't go into too much detail, but happy to take questions on that process. Just one thing to note, we try to embed this into that student journey as well, because I think if you go on to the next slide, Jonathan, I've got some questions. So what we were trying to understand by the evaluation was looking at the experience of the course as a whole. So how did these different elements of the placement, their academic experience and their professional development, which are all kind of three core pillars of that course design, how are they coming together to kind of build foundations of learning? So how does the placement feed into their academic? How does their academic feed into their placement, etc.? And so that's what we were trying to find out with the evaluation. So if you just like to move it on, Jonathan. So I think this is where just to spend the majority of the time, and then I'll have some recommendations that might be to be thinking of. So I'm going to start at the bottom one around moving parts. So as you probably can imagine, delivering a simulated placement for over 600 students is logistically quite a challenging thing to do. And especially, so that's, creating all those resources, providing the space, etc. That meant the course and the way the simulated placement was being delivered changed often and at very late notice. So as we were trying to develop an evaluation plan, so we don't sit in that department, we're a central department, that sometimes those things were not communicated very effectively to us about those changes. And so that meant that we then had to adjust our evaluation plan. And I think that's really crucial about thinking about those pressures. If you're going into a space to do an evaluation, thinking through some of those pressures more would be very, very beneficial as well. I think, so if we go up to the top, one of the things we were really keen on doing is that we developed tools that the staff could use after we left. And I think we achieved that, but also I think what we were unaware of was also the amount of evaluation staff were expected to do already. So the Nursing Council expected them to do kind of a very formal reflection on practice. Then there was, the quality processes within the university, so module evaluations and other surveys. And then there was obviously this going on as well. So that became quite a crowded space. And I think that's really something, again, to reflect on about how your evaluation doesn't necessarily add to that, but how it can help, how you can potentially use all those things to feed into your evaluation as well. And I think we did that, and we also provided evidence for the Nursing Council, which was really beneficial as well for them. So that participatory approach, I think, was really beneficial, although it was hard work as well. And there was a real challenge, which I'll come to, actually. We won't do that one now. But I think that really shaped the evaluation in a way that we wouldn't have done it. And I think that was really beneficial for staff who felt really involved in the process, but was more challenging for the students because these were level 4 students and they didn't necessarily have the context in order to contribute to an advisory group in the way that we might have wanted them to. So I think it's about that appropriateness of level as well, about what you're asking participants to do in that kind of participatory approach. So I've mentioned the survey, so that was one of the big things that came out of the evaluation. So they wanted this survey, they wanted a very reflective piece about practice, rather than this kind of quantitative measures around confidence and things like that as well in there. So I think one of the things that we came to realize is that students on these courses, these 3 courses, had very, very busy lives. So they were on placement, they were on their course, they were doing their academic work, but often they came from, they also had more busier home lives generally. So there was a lot of care, people with caring responsibilities, or there was a very kind of motivation around why they wanted to be in healthcare. That also brought some challenges around how they could engage in activities as well. And I think we've come to a conclusion that there's a hierarchy of engagement or kind of salience with what you asking students to do. And so for us, you know, the evaluation was a priority, but for the students, it was like the last thing in their list that they wanted to do. And I think it's about how we bridge that. And I think one of the things, one of the recommendations is about how we think of going to the students. So very much, you know, build it and they will come. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's about how we build it so they don't have to travel or they don't have to go to something. It's about facilitating that in a more productive way. And I think if you're delivering a course and delivering a learning teaching experience, you can embed this in a way that students maybe don't realize. Obviously they realize because you gain their consent, but I think you've got those relationships there to facilitate some of that as well. And I think, again, so moving on to that relationships, that was just so crucial. The evaluation was challenging, but it would have been way more challenging if we'd not brought the staff on board. So that was a really crucial element. And the engagement of staff was really key because, you know, they promoted the survey for us, they recruited students to come to the activities, but student engagement was really challenging. And again, I think it's reflecting on how we facilitate that better in there. So if you just want to move me on, Jonathan, just some kind of reflections. I might ask Julian as well if we've got time for a minute to reflect on there if he's got something. The staff were involved and contribute to the evaluation design. I think as someone who works in a central directorate, this is absolutely key for our work, that we have to have the buy-in of where that evaluation is taking place. And I think that's something as a team we've always tried to do, but I think in the learning and teaching space, it's even more vital potentially, because often there's not that awareness of why we're evaluating in the same way I would suggest as maybe in the access space. So embedding evaluation in learning and in the delivery of learning and teaching experiences. So we're not we're not asking them to do another survey 2 weeks after they've attended something, but that we're capturing it at that point of the intervention itself. And understanding and go to your participants, what's important to them, you know, and I think this is really crucial when you're thinking about your evaluation as well, and how, you know, one of the things we wanted to look at the course was how students were engaging. And so I think we learned lots of reflections about that, about how we access students and what we're asking of them when they have very busy and often complex lives as well. Have I got a student got a minute? Liz, I didn't realize what time I started. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything, Julian.
Yeah, not much. I think that covers it. The only thing something that really struck me and reinforced stuff that I've seen elsewhere is just the complete difference in perspective between the staff contributors to the evaluation and the students. So the staff had a very bounded concept of simulated placements. It was what they did, you know, had a site and everything. But for students, it was just rolled into their general experience. And when we were talking to students and working with them, we found it really hard to get them to focus on the simulated placement as an entity, and everything else got rolled on as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was the case. And I think it comes back to that, what's important to your participants. The evaluation was about simulated placement, but actually what was important to them was how long it took to travel to their placements for the clinical, or, you know, like there was no parking at the campus. Do you know? And I think so how do you deal with those things and give people the space to explore that while still getting the evidence you need as well, or keeping them focused on that? We're doing questions afterwards, aren't we? Yep.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in the chat, Nathaniel, but we'll do questions all together at the end. So yeah, let Jonathan give his presentation, then we'll come back to it. Thanks.
Brilliant. Then thank you so much. And I think there's actually a really nice thread to pick up from Nathaniel's work, which I think is this presentation very much trying to think about those recommendations and think about those practicalities, but from the institutional strategic perspective, and saying, well, how can we make sure that exactly those sort of projects, as we heard from Nathaniel, can take place at scale across the institution. Just for introductions, I'm Jonathan. I'm part of LSE's Center for Teaching Learning, the Eden Center, where I'm the evaluations manager. And some special thanks for this presentation go to Murray Saunders, professor up in Lancaster University, who gave some really helpful feedback on those slides and was actually a consultant throughout the project I'm presenting on, as well as colleagues here in the Eden Center. Just to give you a rough overview of how I'm going to spend my next 15 minutes, I want to briefly talk to you about a little bit more about what the institutional context was, so really how and why we started to think about evaluation, not just on the project level, but across the school. Some of the theoretical and literature and insights we drew on for that, how we went about it, and then sort of a very embryonic form of impact assessment for evaluation work, actually, and sharing some reflections on that. But yeah, just to begin, really the question, well, why do we think as an institution evaluation should be something high up our agenda? And what's really interesting in the LSE context, there was really three big drivers. And I think we've, to some extent, actually touched on all of them. So the first one here, Educate for Global Impact, that was, we had a new education strategy that came in, really trying to articulate much more clearly what we think our educational offer should be. And alongside that was huge investments. So millions of pounds spent on new activities, enhancing the student experience, enhancing student welfare, and enhancing inclusive education. But now, obviously, that all that money was spent, there was this rising demand to say, well, does it work? Does it make a difference? And with that, we had this first intention, which was saying, well, we need evaluation to make evidence-informed decisions. The second driver actually is a bit more specific to our Teaching and Learning Center, which was actually established around the same time that this evaluation project kicked off, and really was seen as an opportunity to embed teaching and learning. And a lot of actually the terms we heard Liz refer to earlier on all the different things that we could call evaluation in the learning and teaching space, and really embed that much more thoroughly in the teaching practice. So there, this idea was to say, well, we want evaluation to get done because we want to get teaching practitioners to adopt this critical and reflective educational practice. I think one of my colleagues easily put it like, we want to move away from practitioners seeing, for example, a center like Teaching and Learning like a solution shop. Here you go, you get taught how to do a flipped classroom, then you walk out again, but really do something more personal, have that professional development to it. And then last but not least, yes, the regulatory context matters as well, though I think I've highlighted here in a slightly different color, because I think what is quite interesting about the genealogy of our approach is that it did start within the institution. And I think those first two projects were really the overriding ones. One reflection, actually, just maybe for us to pick up later when we go into the breakout, is there is slightly different definitions of teaching, of learning, of student experience in those areas. So I think this first area around evidence-informed decision-making really speaks to an understanding of what we should be evaluating as the wider student experience. Whereas obviously the scholarly approach to education is something that's mainly concerned with what happens in the classrooms, exactly the sort of project that Daniel spoke about. And so I think for us, one of the questions and maybe attention is a little bit to say, well, does one approach, does one sort of framework for evaluation work for all these areas, or is teaching and learning distinct enough that we would want to go about quite differently to say evaluating the puppy cuddling session in the exam season? But yeah, something to think about. Just to say, our approach has been very much to define one overarching framework and go from there. But I'd be curious to hear others' reflections on that as well. Right, I'm so sorry to throw a third definition at you, but we indeed started there. So I think, again, luckily, though, a consistent one with what we heard earlier. So we defined in the first instance evaluation as evaluative practice consists of purposefully gathering, analyzing, and discussing evidence from relevant sources about the quality, worth, and impact of a provision, a development, or policy. Three bits I want to highlight there. So this first bit around, sorry, it's generally this 3 bits I can count. It is firstly around evaluative practice. So there is sort of a wider context that Mary Saunders, again, who we work with on this, really has this social practice approach. But I think why we wanted to emphasize evaluative practice is in a sense to say that there isn't a sort of platonic ideal of what evaluation looks like, but rather it's something we do. It's something we shape. There's rules around that, there's norms around that. And part of what we try to do when we establish evaluation on the institutional level is define these rules and values. So a lot of what we do, there's a lot of control we have over that. which might fly in the face of, say, what the regulator wants, but in theory there's a lot of scope for us to really think carefully about that. The second point to highlight there around relevant sources, I'm not saying we've solved the problem that different stakeholders like to see different types of evidence potentially, but at least at this higher level, we wanted to be really clear that the sort of horses for courses view, that there isn't one gold standard of evidence, but rather your question, your ability to collect data will determine what's the most relevant data for you to collect and consider. And last but not least, and we heard that already, this inextricable link between the quality of a provision, the impact of provision, but also its worth, right? There's almost a normative element there when we say, well, was this a success, was it not? And there we need to be really careful and mindful when we design evaluation. From this definition, or sort of enriching that definition, we actually went back to colleagues across the institution, to the literature, and sort of assembled a small set of values around that for how we wanted to articulate more broadly what we thought good evaluation looked like, what the purposes and the principles of evaluation were. And really one of the core themes that emerged from that was actually this view as evaluation as a bridging tool. And again, this is something that goes back to a paper and work by Murray Saunders. But this idea is really that evaluation can support change, can build a bridge really from what we're doing now to a changed and improved practice, if it helps us get clarity on why we're doing that. In Murray's original work, there's a lot of thinking around sort of, he links it to the Durkheimian notion of enemy, but really I think what as the core of this view is to say that if there's hesitancy to change, or colleagues saying, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to try out, really one way to look at that is to say, well, it's a lack of structures, a lack of values, a lack of norms, because suddenly, what was good teaching practice yesterday is no longer what's good teaching practice now. And that can be an inhibitor to change. In turn, then obviously evaluation becomes that bridging tool and gives us that space to do things differently and better if we allow participants to actually explore those new rules, give them as a space to actually define, well, what is it I want to do? What is it that I value about my activity, and what is it that consistent with the impact I'm actually having? This sort of emerged as a central tenet of the work, but sort of adjacent to that, there was also other principles we adopted, I think a lot of which Nathaniel actually already touched on in practice as well. So the first notion was around evaluation for learning. If you go to the literature, there's normally your standard trifecta that says evaluation is either to improve practice, it's for accountability, right? You do it to show somebody else that you spent the money wisely, or it is for learning. And we really wanted to emphasize this learning element, that there's something around understanding that in its own right can be really valuable as an outcome for evaluation. And that obviously links quite neatly to this notion of evaluation as a bridging tool, where we can say, well, yes, we want you to understand what's different, what that new normal looks like. That therefore is a positive outcome of an evaluation. The second aspect, again, also drawing on that, so saying good evaluation is participatory and is led not necessarily just by the skills of evaluators, but it's also led by the active involvement and the thinking of people involved in the project. Sort of two lines of reasoning getting us there. The one, a little bit like what Nathaniel was saying, is a really pragmatic one that says, look, we as an evaluation team can only offer so much support. There will be a point where we hand over this project to you. So the more we involve you in it, the better a tool set you'll have to take forward to develop your own approach as you go along. But I think this other point also is just a bit more pragmatic, right? In learning theory, you think a lot about authenticity, or think a lot about experiential learning. So there's actually an argument for saying, well, we really want you to understand both your own project in the context of evaluation, but also evaluation as a practice. We want you to be involved in that. And it's sort of learning by doing. That's a vital process of manifesting and creating that understanding that we seek. And last but not least, the maybe most popular notions there around utilization and developmental focused evaluation. So both of those, going back to work by Patton, who really emphasized that good evaluation is useful, right? It's useful to real people in real space. They can do something with it. It's not just a really abstract report that sits on some website, but rather there's concrete things we can do with it. And similarly, this developmental focused notion that says good evaluation is close to the project and supports it in its development as it goes along. And we really wanted to adopt both of these notions I think ultimately to give practitioners confidence, really to put themselves first in a sense, and really start from what their views were on the evaluation, work with them, and justify that in a really robust way. And that actually brings me to the last point, right? This is like a neat literature review, but what's the point of it? Why do it? And I think the first one was the first value this had for us was certainly around legitimizing the approach, right? We're saying part of the audience we're talking to is academics. And there is certainly in our institution, I think, a preconception that evaluation sort of becomes lumped in with a quality assurance, you're teaching evaluation forms. And so by actually drawing on this literature and being able to just pepper in some references in your text, you are able to have a very different discussion and saying, well, no, evaluation is actually a really serious knowledge-producing epistemic endeavor, and we think it's something that's worthwhile of your time. The second point also, I think, is around breaking the mold, right? By putting these options out there, and for example, not immediately equivocating evaluation with a sort of accountability thing you do for others, it's, I think, opened the menu up a little bit when going and sitting down with practitioners and saying, well, look, what do you want from evaluation? Why do you think we should do this evaluation? And really, obviously, you know, in practice, there might well be projects where we say, well, look, it is just because somebody gave you money and they now want to know how you spend it. But at least having that sort of slightly breaking the mold, slightly unusual set of values behind it, I think has been a really valuable door opener to have those discussions. Right, how did we do all that in practice? 4 main areas of activity for us. So we first of all started by producing some resources. Actually, an interesting overlap, some of you may have seen other work coming out of the sector, and obviously the Evaluation Collective around producing evaluation resources and guidance. That's also very much the route I went down. So initially just internally, but by now just on the LSE website for anyone to access. And we put together a short couple documents that really operationalize a lot of the values we set by giving a step-by-step structure to colleagues to follow through when thinking about their own evaluations. Maybe the bit to highlight there is that we really enjoyed using the rough data framework, which again, Mary Saunders' input on the project. But the rough data framework acronym standing of the questions to consider when designing evaluations is the reasons for evaluation, the uses for evaluation, the foci of the questions to focus on, the data to use, and so forth. But I think one of the outstanding features really this questions-based approach to evaluation, saying, okay, so what's the reason you want to do this? What do you think would be helpful to know right now for where your project is at? Then the second point around outreach and networking, really running around the school and offering our services, talking to colleagues, attending team meetings, giving short presentations like these to say, hey, we have an evaluation framework, doing more involved consultancies, or trying to build communities. So we had an initial set of pilot projects where we established a community of practice of sorts. Other and broader brush approaches, for example, for the APP evaluation, we just made sure that everybody is in the room and we can learn from that, and we can sort of create a space where people are capable and encouraged to engage with evaluation. Third thing to I think not underestimate in all this is just funding. So what we did is we established a small pot of money, basically very unbureaucratic to apply for, but that gave projects the funding to, for example, hire research assistants. So we're not talking huge hours, right? I think in practice we've established a sort of 50 to 60 hours, but just having the money essentially provided that projects need to hire a student to work with them on designing a survey, doing some data analysis, and bringing in their expertise and often their experience as a participant as well. Really important. I think it became quite a stable level approach. And then last but not least, I think one of the things to bear in mind is that infrastructure, the wider context in the institution. In our case, there was a lot of work and still ongoing work around making data accessible, thinking about research ethics, so finding ways that do not compromise on the ethical standards of work, but at the same time make it so that projects that just want to send out a quick post-event survey do not have to go through the full 14-page research ethics committee form. But also really pedestrian things. I was working with a lecturer the other day actually, and turned out her Qualtrics account wasn't quite working. So there was a lot of work then back and forth involved to just send out a survey, right? Bearing those small and very pragmatic things in mind as we try to encourage more and more people to do that. So yeah, a lot of work going on. And that brings me to my last slide, which is really the saying of well, what actually drove the change? What worked for us and what worked to the projects we spoke to in terms of encouraging them to adopt evaluation? And the first area we came across, and we did 8 interviews basically for this. So I spoke and debriefed with the projects, did an evaluation of sorts, and listened to the projects a little bit and tried to tease out why they had engaged with the work and what really had enabled them to engage with evaluation practice. And the first point there was around the change in institutional regulatory expectations. So whether it was senior stakeholders and regulators, evaluation happened oftentimes because there was somebody else saying, you need to do evaluation now, and that, you know, made them engage with us in the first place. But I think it's also important to say it was, you know, by itself, I think neither necessary nor sufficient to bring about that change. And that's really the other point, is that I think resourcing became a theme that came up time and time again. It was when we provided the time, the expertise through that consultancy model, but also just a dedicated space to think about evaluation, that projects started to engage with it and really engage with it as part of their own activities and their agenda. A third reflection, I think really interesting, that we also saw that evaluation interwove in with the professional narratives more. So a lot of the people I spoke to mentioned being curious and caring and really having this internal motivation for evaluation. But also, I think this institutional context, the notions of seeking recognition and gaining rewards from it. I think that was a really interesting point Nathaniel also touched on, which is really the sort of reflective practice and wider institutional context against. Because one of the tensions I think we unearthed through those interviews was that a lot of the lecturers we came to were indeed similar to Nathaniel's experience, telling us, oh, we're already doing all of this. There's already so much evaluation happening. You know, we're making tweaks to our lecture slides on the basis of feedback. We talk to our students, we listen to our students, but there isn't, you know, but it's actually not being recognized at evaluation right now. We can't put it in for promotion. We can't use it to make the case that, you know, our teaching practice has had this impact, and so it's being overlooked in the institutional context. And I think there's an interesting role, I think, for evaluation, sort of framing of evaluation, to think about how we can make sure that, yes, we recognize what's happening already, but find a middle ground, but also saying, well, but the sort of structured higher level evaluation we might be thinking about outside the very neat confines of just activity. And last but not least, all the points I made on the having this community aspect to it, incredibly vital. So really important to just giving people confidence, giving them space to explore, reassuring them that what they're doing already is actually really valuable and helpful. And also, I think very pragmatically, right? If you put a meeting in the calendar, work gets done by that deadline usually. So I think there was definitely that element too of really having a social practice at the heart of that. Brilliant. That's me done. Some endnotes. I think due to the recording, we'll have that available. We might be able to upload slides as well. So I think that brings us back to the questions.
Brill. Thank you, Nathaniel and Jonathan. So what you've heard from 2 members of the Evaluation Collective are 2 kind of different perspectives, but with lots of overlapping themes. You've got one very practical example of undertaking an evaluation within a learning teaching space on simulated placements, and then you've got a much more overarching approach from Jonathan about kind of what does this mean and how do we do it and how do we get that institutional kind of cultural change around evaluation in this space. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to take these as questions for the both of you, if that's okay. So the first one is from Anthony, and that's for you, Nathaniel and Julian, which asked a little bit about if you moved away, or you made decisions to move away from your kind of initial type of measurement. How does that tally with your kind of overall objective? So I suppose this is again a question around participatory research as well, isn't it? And about if you're led by your participants, how do you make sure that you're actually measuring, you know, impact in the way that you'd possibly anticipated when you'd started? Do you want to take that one, Nathaniel? I think that's quite an interesting one.
So yeah, it was really interesting, and I think so also because the staff had quite a few assumptions about how previous experience impacted on the confidence and engagement with the simulated placements. So the staff suggested that students that came from a health background where they'd already worked in the sector, that they were less happy with the simulated placement And one of the reasons because of that was because they were already quite confident and they didn't necessarily need that safe space to develop those skills. So kind of because I think confidence is still kind of really crucial to what we were looking at. So it's not something we dropped. It's just, I suppose, what we sought to do was ask students to reflect on how their confidence was built within particular events, or how those events then connected through to other areas of their course. So for example, when we talked about kind of their clinical placement, when they went into hospitals, we asked them to reflect on one skill that they took from the simulated placement that they used and helped them develop their confidence in practice. And what we really saw, that one, the assumption that staff had was correct, that the students that had that experience and the higher level, more years of experience really impacted on how they viewed the simulated placements. But what was interesting on the second survey is that those students found the simulated placement just as useful, because actually they found that they were overly confident about some of the things that they were exploring. So that's a very roundabout way of answering that question. But I think we were still very conscious of kind of experience, of confidence, but what we wanted to do was contextualize that for each student that responded to the survey as well.
Thanks, Nathaniel. And I think it's a real balance, isn't it? And that you find between the kind of ideas that we have as evaluators as to what we might think is the best approach, or what we might have been commissioned to do, and then that your point about making that contextually relevant. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything of anything, are you? So that's really nice. Thank you.
And also the literature really kind of spoke to that, but no one had really looked at it in detail, which I thought was quite interesting as well. That kind of previous experience, how that changes how confidence is, how people feel confident in different situations as well.
Yeah, it sort of it was interesting that we started with quite a broad construct when we were talking about confidence, and we actually wound up refining it quite a lot. So the evaluation was actually a process of reconfiguring the way we thought about confidence. So we actually wound up talking about something that was much more specific than perhaps the broader level concept that we started with. So the kind of very specific types of practice and professional confidence as well.
Fab, thank you. And then just for Jonathan, there's a comment from Stella in the chat as well about one of your slides had the term relevant sources, and the question is around kind of intangible evidence and kind of, I suppose, like the imposition of boundaries and relevance of some of the things that that you might be suggesting. And I wondered if you'd got anything that you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think I was alluding to it a little bit in the beginning when I was saying that we had acknowledged it but not necessarily solved it. So I think one of the discussions we've had is really to say, well, if you have your water cooler chat with your participants, that's probably a much richer, or like a regular water cooler chat with participants will probably give you a tremendous amount of insight into how your activity works and what isn't working. And again, similarly, just using and acknowledging the experience of practitioners that have run this work, and exactly those sort of, yeah, I hope that that's what meant by sort of the intangible evidence, right? They have just done it. They have a good sense of what works, what doesn't, what are issues in the program. And so I think, again, what this participatory approach and really making oftentimes the program leaders the starting point for the evaluation work really encourages is to elicit that evidence and work with it and use it as a starting point. I think what's really interesting, though, is that, and I'm thinking in particular of a project here I did with a teaching colleague, that I think while it's a really helpful starting point for sort of generating hypotheses or generating areas of interest, there's often having that more structured space for data collection in a more sort of more traditional evaluation research sense, be it through surveys, be it through most significant change, be it through interviews, still often adds a lot to that. So even in space where I had some sort of colleagues saying, "Oh yeah, no, well I know what's happening in my course," to say, "Okay, great, like yes, I'll take your word for it. Let's pop that down, and if you think those are the benefits your course is having, let's use it as starting points." but also create space to go beyond that when we actually talk to your participants was often quite eye-opening and often really produced really valuable insights into actually nuances and difference or ways that students had that outcome, but for very different or disparate reasons. So I think it's sort of, yes, starting to acknowledge that, but then also finding ways to go beyond that in practice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julian. So Jonathan, sorry, everybody begins with a J. Really, really nice kind of introductions to different ways of doing things. A kind of a participatory link between the two as well. And we have thought in the Evaluation Collective that we might run a session on participatory evaluation, because I think we all tend to do it slightly differently, but there are some really key principles to it. And it's not, as both have said, it's not an easy thing to grapple with as well. So that's something that we might look at doing in the future. Okay, we've got about half an hour left of the session, and what we had thought is that we would now get some feedback from you. So what's going to happen is that Nathaniel is going to busily put us into breakout groups. I hope he's remembered that that's what we're going to do. Brilliant. And we are going to ask you about 20 minutes, might be a bit less than that actually, if we do it for about 15 minutes, Nathaniel, and then we've got lots of time for conversation. What we'd really like to know from you is what your experiences are, either positive or challenging, in evaluating learning and teaching. So we're really interested in your views on this. And we're also interested in what additional support would be beneficial in evaluating teaching and learning. So what else could either the Evaluation Collective do, or we could kind of connect people into, or what resources could we share, or what connections could we make across the sector in order to be able to do that. So it'd be really nice to hear from you on that, and then we'll have a little bit of time for reflections. We have got a Padlet link that the facilitator, so hopefully you'll have an Evaluation Collective facilitator in your room. I can't multitask, I can't type on the screen and chat, so if I'm in your group, I'll be just chatting and writing notes, and then I will write up on the Padlet. So we've got that as a record as well to share. But hopefully, all being well, we should be about to put you into breakout rooms, and hopefully you can have a chat with other people that are on the call about this about this agenda. I'm going to stop share recording as well.
Bear with me 2 seconds. I'm just trying to make sure that the facilitators are not all in the same room.